What's particularly exciting is that this learning is developing over time. Gary and I have been developing, other people have been developing, and we have a community in which to develop it, and the world's developing it. He didn't produce this. And Gary and I have been studying what I would call the inner life of conflict. This is very much in the recent book that we published, Challenging Conflict. The notion is that conflict has a power over the human psyche, not surprisingly so, because it's such an ingrained part of our life. It's within us. We learn it in different ways. In some of our advanced programs, what we do is ask people, how did you learn about conflict? What did you learn about conflict? When did you learn about it? But it's very much in us. So if you and I got into a conflict, I would have my ways of responding, and you'd have your ways of responding. That would probably be familiar, at least to you, at least to me. And I'd have my ways of responding to your way, and you'd have your, and we'd be off and running. Some more problematic. And that's all going on inside. And there's certainly the issues, whether it's the money, the organization that we're arguing about, the places we have, the jobs in institutions, the jobs we have or don't have. And we have this idea that there is something like what we call a conflict trap. That conflict has the power to keep us trapped. It's almost like another entity in the room, running around, sneaking its way around, and prodding us this way and that way. The challenge, and we call the book Challenging Conflict, not with the view that conflict is challenging, which it is, with the view that we should be able to challenge conflict's power over us. That's an enormous task. The good news is, this is something that I really see the world is taking on in this developmental process. Echoing the rabbi, that's why I think Amira or we are onto something. Is that we have to find ways not to be trapped by conflict, because if we don't find ways, the destructive power of humanity is so much that we could destroy ourselves. So we have this notion of a conflict trap, that when you and I are in conflict, there's you, there's me, and there's conflict. And we have to work together, if we're willing to work together, to deal with conflict. That goes beyond the traditional legal system. Although there's a recognition in the traditional legal system that conflict can be very destructive, therefore we need a construct, a social construct, lawyers, law, judges, to deal with it, and the power of the state to deal with it, all of which I think has its place. But leaves conflict in some ways very much intact. We're just constraining it, controlling it, but we're not dealing with it. The way we treat it is that it's it's like the word is the trickster. It likes to be tricky. And it tricks us by drawing on certain parts of our human nature. There is a metaphor that I like to talk about, which is if you imagine from a religious or metaphysical perspective that just before each person is born into the world, just before that first breath, God comes, and God puts the spirit of life into that person. And in that moment, God puts a little bit extra self-interest in each person. Interest first for one's children, and also for oneself. So that I will worry first about my children and myself before anyone else. Assuming that's what God does. A little bit of extra self-interest. That assures two things. One is survival of the species, and the second is endless conflict. Because if we disagree, and in any way our disagreement threatens my children or me, you're second, and possibly a very distant second. This is the most important thing. That's the way, and a lot of course, research into neuroscience and all that parallels that in a different kind of way. And I've been thinking about it recently because I told that many times, and then I thought recently that there's something else that's true in that little metaphor, which is that when God breathes that spirit of self-interest, God breathes that spirit of self-interest into beings that are all by nature the same. And so that's there too. So we have that underlying sameness, that underlying connection of being all human. And we have that extra little element of self-interest. And I think a lot of the work in conflict resolution is trying to find some place that those two things meet, our sameness and our difference. I think, and I like to think it's not just my desire to think this way, but it's a reality, that there is a real beginnings of consciousness that we professionals who are dealing with conflict are trying to find a way to think about and practice conflict differently. And very much appreciate being part of it, being the opportunity to work as a mediator in that field, but also to work as a teacher with many, many people from different professions who now are drawn together to try to work wholeheartedly with conflict.